The Book of Kings is one of the most brutally honest books in the entire Bible. It's not a polished highlight reel of Israel's greatest moments. Instead, it reads like a painful confession, a raw self-assessment written by a nation looking back at its own history and asking, "Where did we go wrong?" And at the very heart of that soul-searching is a man we think we know well, King Solomon, the wisest and most glorious king in Israel's history. The Book of Kings doesn't hide his fatal flaws behind his glittering achievements. It lays them bare, showing us how the failure of one person can lead to the collapse of an entire community. Solomon's failure was Israel's failure. The story begins with a subtle but powerful warning in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 3. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. The key to that entire sentence is the small word except. It would have been a magnificent tribute if it had ended with, "He walked in the statutes of his father David." But the author of Kings immediately shows us a crack in the foundation of Solomon's faith. The problem was the high places. Here we see a stark difference in perspective compared to the Book of Chronicles, which was written much later for a community trying to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. The author of Chronicles needed a heroic model for the people, so he highlights Solomon's positive side. In 2 Chronicles 1:3, he explains why Solomon went to the high place at Gibeon. Because God's tent of meeting, which Moses, the Lord's servant, had made in the wilderness, was there. Chronicles justifies his actions to establish his legitimacy. But the author of Kings gives us a completely different and more critical angle. He suggests Solomon's choice of Gibeon wasn't about theological purity. It was about size and popularity. He needed a large venue for his 1,000 burnt offerings, and Gibeon was the most important high place. It was where the crowds were already gathering. The author also subtly points out that while the permanent temple hadn't been built yet, the tabernacle of the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant, and a functioning priesthood were already in Jerusalem. Remember, in 1 Kings 2, Adonijah fled to the tabernacle in Jerusalem and grabbed the horns of the altar. The center of true worship was already established. Yet Solomon chose the grand stage of Gibeon over the holy ground of Jerusalem. This choice hints that from the very beginning his leadership was compromising with worldly methods, chasing popular appeal and scale rather than pure devotion. And let's be clear, a high place wasn't just an outdoor chapel. These were originally the headquarters of Canaanite idol worship, centers for honoring Baal and Asherah. According to Deuteronomy 12, God had explicitly commanded Israel to tear down these pagan sites and to worship only in the place he would choose to put his name. For Solomon to offer sacrifices to Yahweh in a place so deeply rooted in idolatry was to walk the path of religious syncretism, mixing the holy with the profane. But Solomon's compromise didn't stop there. His entire reign became a systematic violation of God's commands for a king, laid out clearly in Deuteronomy 17. 1 Kings 3 tells us the trouble started with his marriage. It says, Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his own palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. His first major political act was to marry an Egyptian princess. Egypt was the nation that had enslaved Israel for 400 years. More than that, it was a cultural and military superpower. Deuteronomy specifically warned against returning to Egypt or getting entangled with it. Yet the first thing Solomon does is break that boundary.
He sought security and stability not from his covenant relationship with God, but from a political alliance with the world's greatest power. He was so proud of this union that he paraded Pharaoh's daughter in the city of David for all to see. This was just the beginning. 1 Kings 11:1 tells us, King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter: Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. The Hebrew word used here for loved is the same word used for loving God. The text is making a sharp point. Solomon gave the devotion that belonged to God to these foreign women.
And tragically, in 1 Kings 11, we see the result. He built shrines for their gods on the hills surrounding Jerusalem. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. With 1,000 wives and concubines, can you imagine how many pagan altars dotted the landscape? The holy city became a den of idols. The seeds of Israel's destruction were sown right there by its wisest king. Solomon's disobedience continued. He ignored the command not to acquire great numbers of horses from Egypt, building up a massive military force. He scoffed at the rule not to accumulate large amounts of silver and gold, making silver in Jerusalem as common as stones. Even his building priorities reveal his divided heart. Look at that verse in 1 Kings 3:1 again. The author lists the construction projects in this order: his own palace and the temple of the Lord. He puts the palace first. Now we know from later chapters that the temple was actually finished first. The author deliberately changed the order to show us where Solomon's true passion lay. And the timeline confirms it. It took him 13 years to build his own magnificent palace, but only 7 years to build the house of the Lord. His palace was also 4 times larger than the temple. Where we invest our best time, energy, and resources reveals what we truly worship. So why was Israel ultimately destroyed by Babylon? The story of Solomon is the answer in miniature. They were a people who said they loved God, but in reality they loved the world more. They went through the motions of worship, but their hearts longed for material success and political security. Solomon didn't love and serve God with a pure heart. His heart was captivated by his own glory, distracted by foreign women, and devoted to wealth. There is no doubt Solomon was a wise king. The wisdom he asked for was a discerning heart to govern his people justly. But he corrupted that sacred God-given gift, turning it into a personal tool to build his own wealth, fame, and political stability. Once his fear of the Lord wavered, that same wisdom became an instrument that accelerated his pride and corruption. The book of Ecclesiastes, believed to be written by Solomon in his old age, is his belated confession. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. After a lifetime of chasing everything the world had to offer, he admits it was all empty. His wisdom and knowledge had only brought him pain. And his final conclusion was simple and clear. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Solomon knew that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but his life failed to match his knowledge. His story perfectly mirrors Israel's story, a people who professed love for God, but whose actions showed a deeper love for the comfort and security of the world. The Book of Kings does not hold up Solomon's glamorous success as a model to follow. On the contrary, it uses his tragic mistakes to issue a stark warning. It screams at us to see what happens to an individual and to a community when faith becomes disconnected from life. Solomon's story is not a blueprint for success. It is a cautionary tale, a lesson learned through failure, urging us to learn from his mistakes before we make them ourselves.
Please consider subscribing and supporting Logos Community in our mission to spread the gospel. Thank you.